You're watching The Daisy Cousens Show, and I'm Daisy Cousens. Well, in news that will certainly come as a relief to a lot of Americans, the US Federal Reserve has cut interest rates by 0.5 percentage points. As the most important central bank in the world, what does that mean for Australia, and more to the point, Australian mortgage holders? Joining me to discuss that and all the latest economic news that's hitting your hip pocket is Chief Economist at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, John Humphreys. John, welcome to the show. So this interest rate cut by the US Federal Reserve, it's a huge deal. What does this mean for Australia, if anything?
Well, it's a very big deal, as you say, for the Americans. For Australia, it's probably not going to be experienced much by the people at home. The immediate impact is that the Australian dollar will bump up slightly, and it has, but people aren't really going to notice that too much. The bigger question is whether the Reserve Bank of Australia is going to follow suit. And there's a couple of reasons to think that that might not happen in Australia, which means we won't really get any impact from this. The first reason to think that is that the Reserve Bank's already said that they're probably not going to follow suit, so we can just take them at their word. But secondly, what they're saying makes sense. Australia still has higher inflation than the other comparable countries. So New Zealand is cutting rates, the UK is cutting rates, Canada's cutting rates, America's cutting rates. These countries all have lower inflation, and except for Canada, they all still have interest rates higher than ours. So they're in quite a different situation. If they've got interest rates over 5% and inflation under 3%, cutting makes sense for them. We've got inflation still above 3%, and our interest rates were already 1% lower than those comparable countries. So we probably shouldn't expect the RBA to be taking their lead from America at this point. It's probably still expectation as usual, which is depending on the data comes out of the rest of this year, there may be a move at the end of this year or the beginning of next.
Gosh, hard to be a mortgage holder in Australia at the moment. Hopefully we get some interest rate relief as soon as we possibly can. Now, look, the Business Council of Australia has finally shown some signs of life in the fact that they have been calling for productivity reform. You and I, last time we spoke, talked a lot about productivity and how we really have a crisis of that in Australia and have for some time. But you think the ideas of the Business Council are weak tea, as you put it. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, certainly. The Business Council is good at repeating the start of the story, the start of the narrative, that we need productivity reform. Productivity is being too low. It's holding back the economy. Something must be done. But then you look at the detail of what the Business Council wants to say, and they basically squib all the hard choices. So firstly, they pay homage to the modern religion by going and worshipping at the climate cult. And that's not going to be boosting productivity in the slightest. I think they're just trying to buy some love from their political masters, perhaps. And then they go on to what really matters, which is shrinking the size of government and shrinking tax rates. And they basically squib it. They'll say, oh, we need tax reform, but it's always couched in this mealy-mouthed terms of a little cut here and a little increase over there. And they're just trying to rebalance the deck chairs on the Titanic, whereas what Australia desperately needs is significant tax cuts without any offsetting tax increases. We don't need to be balancing the amount of revenue the government gets. The government needs to be getting less of our money, full stop. Not comma and increase tax on someone else, just full stop at that point. And the Business Council seems to squib on that. I think maybe they're still trying to look like the nice guys and so they don't want to ask for the things they think are politically difficult. But if they're not willing to ask for tax cuts, then there's very few industry groups, there's very few groups out there that have the ear of the government and can explain to them that Australia desperately needs a productivity agenda that desperately needs to include real serious tax cuts. And they're still missing in that game, unfortunately.
Oh, God, that is a shame, isn't it? I mean, you and I, we are very much on the same page when it comes to taxes, which is to say that they need to be lowered in Australia. But the good news is the Australian Taxpayers Alliance has just started a campaign in Queensland to pressure LNP and Labor to commit to tax cuts in the lead up to the Queensland election. Tell us all about it.
Yes, well, we have an election up here in Queensland in about 5 weeks, so it's coming up very soon. And until now, there's been a lot of media coverage of this election, and it's all been about these sort of cynical handouts from Labor versus vague motherhood statements from the coalition, from the Liberal National Party. So there's been very little actual policy discussion or anything really you could sink your teeth into that's substantive. So we're trying to, maybe in vain, but we're trying to encourage a serious policy discussion on the tax front in Queensland. And to that end, we put forward a 4-point tax cutting agenda, which is, of course, we're talking about cutting tax for boosting productivity, increasing the amount of disposable income, so reducing the cost of living, and hopefully put downward pressure on housing. So it's doing all those things I normally talk to you about. I have, given that we're trying to sell this to Liberal and Labor just before an election, we have framed these as quite achievable, pragmatic and affordable changes. So there is no real reason that the major parties should just turn around and ignore this, because there's some real good steps forward they could do straight away. So one example, for instance, is the Labor government in their last budget, they just splashed money everywhere trying to rebuy election. And in doing that, they had like 10 different big handouts. One of those policies was a good one. They reduced car registration fees. Now, unfortunately, they only did it for 1 year. It doesn't impact the budget that much. It helps the country. It helps cost of living. We're calling on both of the Labor and the Liberal National Opposition to endorse keeping that, making that permanent. So make the rego cut permanent. We're calling for abolishing stamp duty on newly built houses. So you see a lot of discussion about removing stamp duty on people who buy their first house, and that's great. But what we really need in this country is more houses being built. So the incentive has to be on newly built houses. So remove the stamp duty on newly built houses, regardless of who buys that house. And we've also called for a pushing down of the payroll tax in quite a sustainable way, just increasing the threshold so that small businesses aren't stung in the payroll tax system. And also, Queensland has one of the most absurd payroll tax systems in the country, where medium-sized businesses actually pay a higher marginal payroll tax rate than big businesses do. So we're calling for getting rid of that anomaly and basically cutting the payroll tax for medium-sized businesses by just under 1%. So these 4 changes, they would all push the state in the right direction. They're all substantive. You can get the teeth into them. They're not just sound bites. They're real policy reforms, but they won't break the bank. And so we're calling on both the government and the opposition to commit to embracing this tax-cutting agenda and implementing it within the first year of their next term of government.
Well, I certainly hope they listen to you, because we get taxed out the wazoo in Australia on just about every front. You can't jump sideways in Australia without getting taxed for it. So I really commend you and the ATA for putting that together. Now, look, just before we go, speaking of Labor, let's jump to federal Labor. They look likely to introduce free childcare, at least for low-income families, in the lead-up to the next federal election, which is quite a big deal. Now, do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea?
Yeah, well, speaking of cynical handouts, I guess that segues quite nicely. The problem with this, there needs to be a separation of 2 topics here. One is the discussion of, does the government want to be giving help to families and parents? So that's one topic of discussion. And I think the political consensus is that probably yes, to some degree. And then the question is, well, who should actually be running the details of how that works? So there is an option other than the government's option. If you want to help parents, you want to help families, instead of subsidizing the decisions you want them to make, just directly give the money to those families and allow them to make their own decisions. And so this would actually give more choice to parents, allowing parents to make the decisions that are right for them. It's not shoehorning everyone into this one model where the government tries to make sure you pop out a baby, you send them off to the baby factory, you get back to work so that you can work more and pay more taxes. Some people might want to spend less time with their kids and more time in the factory, and God bless them, to each their own. Some parents won't want to make that choice. And we should let the parents be able to control that choice. Give them the money directly. Some will use that money to pay for daycare. Some will use it to be able to bring up their kid themselves. Some will use it to form a co-op. Some will use it to pay the kids' grandparents to be able to look after the kids. There's lots of potential solutions out there. And the idea of just funneling every family to send their kids off to these big children factories that's one option. But we shouldn't be spending up to, $20 billion a year now, getting close to, funneling everyone into that one option. And you see the way the government defends or justifies this scheme. They nearly always end up justifying it by saying this will increase workforce participation, which is such a cynical thing to say about how you bring up children. I mean, there's very few bigger topics for a parent than how you bring up children. And the goal shouldn't be workforce participation, because ultimately, if you're worried about the health of the economy, and I'm an economist, I do care about this, participation doesn't give you a better life, productivity does. I mean, the government is the so-called 3Ps, population, participation, and productivity. Only one of those sustainably improves the quality of our life, productivity. And yet the government just keeps boosting the population and trying to boost participation. That is not the way forward. So what we need to be doing is giving the control back to the parents, let them make the decision. By the way, there's some parents out there that don't have the option of using childcare. If you're a shift worker, if you're working at nights, you're working strange hours, if you're nowhere near a childcare provider, the government just, work it out yourself. We'll just funnel all of the money into the cities to make sure that everyone goes into this one approved government approach. And so more choice to parents. It would also put downward pressure on the price of childcare, because some parents out there may have noticed every time there's an increase in childcare subsidies, there's an increase in childcare prices. That's not a coincidence. So the model I'm suggesting would actually get to better childcare and just crucially, again and again, more choice for parents.
Absolutely. Very well said, John Humphreys. Thank you so much for coming on the program this evening. It's always great to have your expert take on all things economic, and I cannot wait to speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all we have time for this evening on the Daisy Cousens Show, and I do hope you enjoyed watching the program as much as I enjoyed presenting it. Thank you so much to my wonderful guests and to all the wonderful people behind the scenes who always make this show possible. Coming up next is Nick Cater's Reality Bites. Good night, world. I'll see you next week.